The cardboard box tumbled from Emily's hands, children's books scattering across the polished marble floor. Her voice trembled into the phone. "I don't know how to start over, Claire. How do you rebuild when everything was just a lie?" Daniel Grant froze mid-step, Sophie's bag weighing heavy on his shoulder. That broken whisper, he'd heard it in his own voice 3 years ago. Kneeling among the scattered books, Emily's wedding ring glinted under the overhead light. But it was the tiny Mickey Mouse backpack that made Daniel's chest tighten. "Mommy, why are you crying? Is it because Daddy doesn't love us anymore?" The question echoed down the hallway, but Daniel heard something else. The beginning of everything changing. Emily Harper had always been the kind of woman who preferred shadows to spotlights. At 32, she possessed a quiet beauty that drew second glances without demanding them. Auburn hair that caught light like autumn leaves, green eyes that seemed to hold stories she'd never tell. But tonight, sitting on the cold marble floor of her new downtown Seattle apartment building, she felt anything but beautiful. She felt shattered. The phone call with her sister Claire had ended 20 minutes ago, but Emily remained frozen in place, surrounded by the debris of her former life. Children's books, family photos still in their frames, and cardboard boxes filled with the remnants of a marriage that had imploded 3 weeks ago when she'd found those text messages on Marcus's phone. Her husband of 8 years, successful attorney, pillar of the community, father to their 6-year-old daughter Lily, had been living a double life for over a year. "Mommy, can I have my teddy bear?" Lily's voice drifted from their new apartment, innocent and trusting. Emily closed her eyes, trying to summon the strength to pretend everything was normal. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that Daddy had chosen someone else? That the life you'd built together was nothing more than an elaborate performance? The luxury apartment building was a far cry from their suburban home in Bellevue. 32nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, modern fixtures that probably cost more than most people's cars. Emily could afford it, barely, thanks to the settlement negotiations. But money couldn't buy back her sense of self, couldn't repair the trust that had shattered along with her marriage. She gathered the scattered books with methodical precision, each movement deliberate and careful. Pride had always been Emily's armor, the thing that kept her chin up when the world felt too heavy. Daniel Grant had been standing in that hallway for 3 full minutes, and he still hadn't moved. The woman's voice had stopped, but something about the scene held him captive. As CEO of Grant Technologies, Daniel was accustomed to making decisions quickly, efficiently, without emotional interference. At 41, he'd built his tech company from a garage startup to a billion-dollar enterprise through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to read people. But standing there, watching this stranger navigate her own personal devastation, he felt an unwelcome surge of recognition. 3 years ago, he'd been the one sitting on cold floors, trying to piece together the fragments of a life he'd thought was solid. Victoria had been gone for 6 months when the divorce papers arrived, along with her demands for half of everything he'd built. She'd left Sophie when their daughter was just 6, the same age as the little girl whose voice he'd just heard, claiming that motherhood was stifling her authentic self. The irony wasn't lost on him that her authentic self had included his former business partner and a new life that didn't include their daughter. He watched Emily stand up with a grace that seemed almost practiced, as if she'd been rehearsing how to hold herself together in public. There was something about her careful composure that reminded him of Sophie, the way his daughter had learned to be strong beyond her years. Daniel forced himself to move, his footsteps echoing in the marble corridor. As he passed, Emily looked up, and for just a moment, their eyes met. Hers were the color of Seattle rain, gray-green and impossibly deep. Beautiful, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, and completely, utterly guarded. "Are you all right?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Years of corporate control abandoned in the face of genuine concern. Emily's response was immediate and practiced. "I'm fine, thank you." But her voice carried the same hollow quality he remembered from his own voice during those first impossible months. She turned back to her books, dismissing him with polite efficiency. Daniel recognized the technique. He'd perfected it himself. But as he unlocked his apartment door, he couldn't shake the image of those rain-colored eyes. The next morning brought Seattle's signature drizzle, the kind of persistent mist that made the city feel wrapped in gray cashmere. Emily stood in the lobby at 7:45, Lily's hand tucked securely in hers, both of them dressed in coordinated sweaters that had once made Marcus proud. Now they were just armor, pretty, respectable armor that said, "We're doing fine, really." "Mummy, I forgot my library card," Lily announced with 6-year-old urgency. "We can't get new books without it." Emily's heart sank. The library card was upstairs, somewhere in the boxes they hadn't yet unpacked. But Lily's first day at her new school was in 2 hours, and Emily had promised they'd stop by the downtown branch first, a small adventure to start their new life. She'd planned everything carefully, timed it perfectly. She hadn't planned on forgetting her elevator access card. The morning commute rushed past them as Emily stood in the lobby, pressing the call button uselessly. The elevator required keycard access, and hers was sitting on the kitchen counter 32 floors above. She'd been so focused on getting Lily ready, on being the composed, capable mother she needed to be, that she'd forgotten the most basic thing. "Is the elevator broken?" Lily asked, pressing her face against the polished steel doors. "No, sweetheart. Mommy just made a silly mistake." Emily's voice remained calm, even as embarrassment heated her cheeks. She considered calling the concierge, but the desk was empty. Shift change, probably. Her phone showed 7:52. Lily's new school started at 8:30, and Emily had wanted to arrive early. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors slid open to reveal Daniel Grant in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his expression unreadable. Sophie stood beside him in a neat school uniform, her dark hair braided with mathematical precision. "Going up?" Daniel's voice was professionally courteous, but Emily caught something else underneath, a warmth he was trying to hide. "Yes, thank you. 32nd floor." Emily's response was equally polite as she and Lily stepped into the elevator. The space suddenly felt smaller, charged with an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. Sophie looked at Lily with curious eyes. "I like your backpack. Mickey Mouse is cool." "Thanks, I'm Lily. We just moved here yesterday." Lily's natural friendliness filled the awkward silence that stretched between the adults. "I'm Sophie. I live on 31 with my dad. Are you starting school today?" "Uh-huh. Ocean View Elementary. I'm nervous." Lily's honesty made Emily's chest tight with protective love. "That's my school too. Mrs. Patterson is the best teacher ever. She has a reading corner with beanbags and everything." Sophie's enthusiasm was genuine, infectious. Daniel watched his daughter's face light up in a way he hadn't seen in months. Sophie had always been cautious around new people, especially other children. Her therapist called it adaptive wariness, a fancy term for the way children learn to protect themselves when the adults in their lives prove unreliable. But here she was, chattering away to this little girl as if they'd been friends forever. "Daddy, can Lily sit with me at lunch today?" Sophie's question broke into his observations. "That's up to Lily and her mum," Daniel replied, his corporate training kicking in. "Never make promises for other people. Never assume." Emily looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and felt something crack inside her chest. Since the separation, Lily had become quieter, more hesitant. The idea of her finding a friend on her first day felt like a small miracle. "If you'd like that, sweetheart. Sophie seems very nice." Emily's smile was genuine for the first time in weeks. The elevator chimed at the 31st floor, and Daniel hesitated for just a moment before stepping out with Sophie. As the doors began to close, Sophie called out, "See you at school, Lily. See you at school." Lily waved back, bouncing slightly on her toes. Emily watched the numbers climb to 32, feeling something she hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe this move hadn't been a mistake. Maybe there were good people in this building, kind fathers who raised children to be welcoming to newcomers. Over the next 3 weeks, Emily and Daniel fell into a careful dance of polite encounters. They'd nod to each other in the lobby, exchange pleasantries during school pickup, share the occasional elevator ride with the comfortable distance of people who recognized something in each other, but weren't quite ready to name it. Their daughter's friendship had blossomed into something beautiful. Sleepovers, art projects, shared homework sessions that somehow always seemed to require both parents' presence. One Saturday afternoon, Emily was struggling with a particularly stubborn box in the hallway when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Daniel approaching with a small toolbox in his hand. "Need some help?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes concerned. Emily's first instinct was to decline, to insist she could handle it herself. She'd been handling everything herself for months now, but the box was heavy, and her back was aching, and something about Daniel's patient expression made her defenses waver. "Actually," she said, surprising herself, "that would be wonderful." Daniel set down his toolbox and examined the stuck box. "This tape is industrial strength. Whoever packed this meant business." He produced a box cutter from his toolkit and made quick work of the stubborn adhesive. "There we go." "Thank you," Emily said, genuinely grateful. "I was beginning to think I'd need a crowbar." "Moving is tough," Daniel replied, helping her lift the now opened box. "Especially when you're doing it alone." Emily felt a flush of embarrassment. "I'm not usually so helpless. It's just been a lot of changes all at once." Daniel's expression softened. "I remember. 3 years ago I was in a similar situation. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of starting over from scratch." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "If you ever need anything, tools, an extra pair of hands, someone to watch Lily while you handle errands, I'm right across the hall." Emily looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since that night in the hallway. She saw kindness in his eyes, but also understanding, the look of someone who'd been where she was and survived it. "That's very kind of you," she said quietly. "I might take you up on that." "Please do," Daniel replied, and Emily caught something in his voice that suggested he meant it more than simple neighborly courtesy would require. Their first real conversation happened 2 days later, when both girls came down with the same stomach bug that had been making its way through Ocean View Elementary. Emily found herself juggling Lily's fever, work calls she couldn't miss, and the growing panic that came with being a single parent dealing with a sick child. When her doorbell rang at 10 in the morning, Emily opened it to find Daniel standing in the hallway with a thermal bag and a concerned expression. "Sophie mentioned that Lily was sick too," he said. "I made soup for Sophie and thought you might be able to use some extra. I know how challenging it can be when you're handling everything alone." Emily felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness of the gesture. "That's incredibly thoughtful. Please come in." Daniel's presence in her apartment felt both foreign and oddly comforting. He moved with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to managing a household, helping her set up a makeshift sick bay in the living room where both girls could rest while still being supervised. "How do you do it?" Emily asked as they sat together on her couch, watching their daughters sleep fitfully on air mattresses they'd dragged out from the closet. "Do what?" Daniel replied quietly. "This, single parenting, making it look so effortless." Emily gestured at the organized chaos of their impromptu sick ward. I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water most days." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "It doesn't feel effortless," he said finally. "Most days I feel like I'm improvising, making it up as I go along and hoping I don't mess her up too badly in the process." Emily looked at him in surprise. "Really? You always seem so composed? In control?" Daniel's laugh was rueful. "That's 3 years of practice and a lot of trial and error. When Victoria first left, I was a disaster. I didn't know how to braid hair or pack school lunches or navigate the social politics of elementary school friendships. I learned because I had to, but it wasn't pretty." Emily felt something inside her chest loosen at his honesty. "I keep thinking I should have figured it out by now, that there's some parenting manual I missed that would tell me how to do this right." "There is no manual," Daniel said gently. "And there's no right way. There's just showing up every day and doing your best with whatever tools you have." He paused, glancing at their sleeping daughters. "And accepting help when it's offered, which is something I had to learn the hard way." Emily followed his gaze to Lily and Sophie, who had somehow migrated closer to each other in their sleep, like magnets drawn together by the comfort of friendship. "They make it look so easy," she observed. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," Daniel replied. "And sometimes they're better at healing than we are. Sophie has been happier in the past 3 weeks than she's been in 3 years. Having Lily as a friend has given her something I couldn't, the understanding that comes from shared experience." Emily felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. "I think Lily feels the same way. She's been so withdrawn since the separation, but with Sophie, she's like her old self again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft sound of their daughter's breathing and the Seattle rain against the windows creating a cocoon of unexpected peace. Emily found herself thinking about Daniel's words, about showing up and doing your best. Maybe that was enough. Maybe she didn't have to be perfect to be a good mother. "Daniel," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." Emily hesitated, then plunged ahead. "What happened with your ex-wife? I mean, you don't have to answer if it's too personal, but Sophie mentioned her mother doesn't live here, and I just wondered—" Daniel was quiet for so long that Emily began to regret asking. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, if tinged with old pain. "Victoria left when Sophie was 6, he said simply. "She said motherhood was stifling her, that she needed to find herself. She moved in with my former business partner, and started a new life that didn't include us." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "She sends birthday cards and Christmas presents, but she's never asked for custody or even regular visitation. It's like we were a chapter in her life that she finished reading and put away." Emily felt her heart break a little for both Daniel and Sophie. "I'm so sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was," Daniel admitted. "Not just the betrayal, but the way it happened. One day we were a family, and the next day she was just gone. Sophie kept asking when Mommy was coming home, and I had to find ways to explain that some people just aren't built for unconditional love." Emily heard the echo of her own experience in his words, different circumstances, but the same fundamental betrayal of trust. "How did you help Sophie understand?" "Therapy, mostly," Daniel said with a slight smile. "Dr. Martinez has been wonderful with her. And time, lots of time and patience, and the gradual understanding that we could be a complete family even if we weren't the family we'd started out to be." Emily nodded, thinking about her own struggles to help Lily process their changed circumstances. "I've been considering therapy for Lily, and maybe for myself too. I keep wondering if I missed signs, if I should have seen what was coming." Daniel turned to look at her directly, his expression serious. Emily, can I tell you something I learned the hard way? She nodded. The people who betray us don't succeed because we're naive or blind. They succeed because they're skilled at deception, and we're not skilled at detecting it. That's not a character flaw. That's humanity. The ability to trust completely is actually a strength, even when it gets used against us. Emily felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the tears of despair she'd become accustomed to. These felt almost like relief. You really believe that? I have to believe it, Daniel said simply. Otherwise, what's the alternative? Becoming so guarded that we never trust anyone again? That's not living. That's just surviving. Emily considered his words, feeling something shift inside her chest. For months, she'd been focused solely on survival, protecting herself and Lily from further harm, building walls high enough to keep out potential pain. But sitting here with Daniel, watching their daughters find comfort in friendship, she began to wonder if perhaps it was time to consider the difference between surviving and actually living. Thank you, she said quietly. For the soup, for the help today, for this. I hadn't realized how much I needed to have this conversation. Daniel's smile was warm and genuine. Thank you for letting me help. It's been a long time since I felt useful to another adult. As the afternoon wore on and their daughters slowly recovered, Emily found herself thinking about Daniel's words about trust and betrayal. Maybe he was right. Maybe the problem hadn't been her ability to trust, but Marcus's willingness to exploit that trust. Maybe there was a difference between being careful and being closed off entirely. That evening, after Daniel had taken Sophie home and Lily was tucked into her own bed, Emily stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt something other than dread about the future. It wasn't hope, exactly. That still felt too dangerous. But it was possibility. The tentative understanding that maybe someday she might be ready to trust again. What Emily didn't know was that in less than 24 hours, that possibility would be tested in ways she never could have imagined. Because while she'd been focused on healing from Marcus's betrayal, the full scope of his deception was still waiting to be discovered. And when it was, Emily would need every ounce of strength she'd built up, as well as the support of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to have your faith in love completely shattered. The next evening, Emily was expecting her attorney to drop off the final divorce papers when there was a knock at her door. But instead of her lawyer, she found Daniel standing in the hallway with a manila envelope in his hand and an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "But I think there's been a mistake. This was delivered to my apartment by mistake. It's addressed to you, but the apartment number was wrong." Emily's stomach dropped as she recognized the law firm's letterhead. Not her divorce attorney, but something else. Something that made Daniel look concerned. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. Daniel didn't move. Something in Emily's expression, the way her face had gone pale, the careful way she was holding the envelope, triggered every protective instinct he'd learned to recognize over 3 years of single parenthood. "Emily," he said quietly, "are you all right?" The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly undid her. Emily felt the familiar sting of tears and turned away, clutching the envelope against her chest. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think I'm about to find out." Daniel should have walked away. Every rational part of his mind told him to respect her privacy, to return to his own apartment and his own carefully ordered life. But something about the defeated slope of Emily's shoulders, the way she was trying so hard to hold herself together, reminded him too vividly of his own darkest moments. "Emily," he said again, his voice gentler now, "if you need someone to sit with you while you read whatever that is, you don't have to face it alone." Emily turned back to face him, and Daniel saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten with recognition. It was the look of someone who'd been hit so many times they were bracing for the next blow. "Would you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't think I can handle another crisis by myself." "Of course," Daniel said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." As they rode the elevator up to Emily's apartment in silence, both of them could feel the weight of whatever was in that envelope. Neither of them knew that they were about to discover the true scope of Marcus's betrayal, or that the revelation would bind them together in ways they never could have anticipated. Because sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the foundation for the best ones, and sometimes the person who helps you face your darkest truth becomes the person you want to share your brightest future with. Emily's apartment felt different with Daniel in it, smaller somehow, but also safer. They'd arranged for Sophie to stay with a neighbor for the evening, and Lily was already asleep, which left them alone with whatever bombshell was waiting in the manila envelope. Emily sat at her kitchen table, the envelope in front of her like an unexploded device. Daniel sat across from her, his presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. She'd been telling herself for months that she was handling everything fine on her own, but now, faced with the possibility of another devastating revelation, she realized how exhausting it had been to pretend constant strength. "Take your time," Daniel said gently. "Whatever it is, we'll figure out how to handle it." Emily opened the envelope with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. Inside were legal documents that made her previous pain seem like a gentle bruise compared to this devastating blow. Federal charges, criminal investigation, her name listed as a potential co-conspirator in Marcus's financial crimes that she was only now learning existed. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit embezzlement, amounts in the millions. Years of illegal activity that had apparently been funding their comfortable suburban lifestyle. "Emily," Daniel said, noting her sudden pallor. "What is it?" She slid the documents across the table with shaking hands, unable to speak. Daniel read quickly, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is significant," he said carefully. "Emily, these charges are federal. Do you have a criminal defense attorney?" "I have a divorce attorney," Emily whispered, "but not a criminal defense lawyer. Daniel, they think I was involved. They think I knew about the money laundering, the client theft, all of it. How could I prove I didn't know when I lived in a house paid for with stolen money?" The confession hung between them like a bridge Emily couldn't cross back over. She'd said too much, revealed too much. Now Daniel would see her for what prosecutors apparently believed she was. Either a criminal or a fool so willfully blind that she might as well have been complicit. But instead of judgment, Emily saw something else in Daniel's eyes, something that looked almost like relief. 3 years ago," Daniel said quietly, "I discovered that my wife had been having an affair with my business partner. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was learning that they'd been planning to steal proprietary technology and client lists to start their own competing company. Victoria had convinced me to give James access to sensitive information, to trust him with relationships that took me years to build." Emily stared at him, processing this revelation. "When she left," Daniel continued, "she didn't just take my marriage. She nearly destroyed everything I'd worked for. I spent months questioning every decision I'd made, every moment of trust, wondering how I could have been so blind." Emily felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Here was someone who understood the peculiar shame of having been thoroughly deceived by someone you'd trusted completely. "That's the point," Daniel said gently. "We never see it coming because we don't want to see it. We trust because the alternative, Believing that the person we love is capable of that kind of betrayal is too painful to consider. But this is different, Emily said, gesturing at the legal documents. This is federal criminal charges, prison time. They could take Lily away from me. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but certain. Emily, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. When you found those text messages on Marcus's phone, were you shocked? Or were you finally seeing confirmation of something you'd suspected all along? Emily considered the question, replaying those devastating moments when her world had crumbled. I was shocked, she said slowly, completely blindsided. I thought we were happy. I thought our marriage was solid, our future secure. I had no idea he was capable of that kind of deception. That's your answer, Daniel said simply. If you'd suspected something, if you'd been willfully blind, you wouldn't have been shocked. You would have been devastated, but not surprised. There's a difference. Emily felt tears threatening for the first time since opening the envelope. You really believe that? I know that, Daniel replied, because I lived it. When I discovered Victoria's betrayal, I was shocked too. Looking back, there were probably signs I could have recognized if I'd been suspicious. But I wasn't suspicious because I trusted her. That's not a character flaw, Emily, that's love. Emily studied his face, seeing not just kindness but a deep understanding born from his own painful experience. What do I do now? How do I fight federal charges when I don't even understand what Marcus was doing? First, you get a criminal defense attorney, Daniel said practically. I know someone excellent, Claire Morgan. She's one of the best in the city, and she's helped me with some business matters. You would do that? Make that call for me? Emily asked, amazed by his willingness to involve himself in her crisis. Emily, Daniel said simply, you don't have to face this alone. Whatever happens, whatever we discover about Marcus's activities, you don't have to handle it by yourself. The word we hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, but free from pressure. Emily felt something shifting inside her chest, a cautious opening she'd thought was permanently sealed. Within hours, Daniel had arranged a meeting with Claire Morgan for the following morning. As they waited for the attorney's call back, Emily found herself opening up about her marriage in ways she'd never done with anyone. She talked about the gradual erosion of her confidence, the way Marcus had slowly taken control of all financial decisions. He convinced me I was bad with money, Emily admitted. Said my background in art history made me impractical, unrealistic about financial matters. So I let him handle everything. Investments, taxes, even our household budget. Daniel listened without judgment, recognizing the pattern of emotional manipulation that often accompanied financial abuse. Victoria did something similar, he said. Made me feel like I was too focused on work to handle the emotional aspects of our relationship. She positioned herself as the expert on feelings, on Sophie's needs. As evening fell and they ordered takeout for dinner, Emily realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite boundaries that had kept them safely apart, had dissolved entirely under the pressure of crisis and honest conversation. Daniel, Emily said as they cleaned up the dinner dishes, I need you to know something. What's that? Emily turned to face him, seeing patience and understanding in his expression. I haven't talked to anyone about what really happened in my marriage. Not my sister, not my friends, not even my therapist. But tonight, with you, I felt safe enough to tell the truth. That means more to me than you probably realize. Daniel's smile was soft but serious. Emily, I want you to know that whatever happens with this investigation, whatever new complications arise, I'm not going anywhere. This isn't too much for me to handle. Emily felt her chest tighten with emotion. How can you be so sure? We barely know each other outside of crisis management." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. 3 months ago, if someone had told me that I'd be willing to get involved in a federal investigation to help a woman I'd just met, I would have suggested therapy. But Emily, I've learned something important about myself lately. What's that? Daniel's smile was gentle but certain. I've learned that I'm not afraid of complicated anymore. I'm only afraid of empty. And you're not empty, Emily. You're complicated and challenging and probably more than I bargained for. But you're also kind and strong and real in a way that I'd forgotten people could be. Emily felt tears prick her eyes at the honesty in his words. And you don't think I'm too much trouble? I think you're exactly the right amount of trouble. Daniel replied. I think we're both exactly complicated enough to understand how precious it is when you find someone who sees all your complications and chooses to stay anyway. The next morning brought Claire Morgan's reassuring presence in her downtown office. Claire was a petite woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an immediate confidence that made Emily feel, for the first time since opening that envelope, like she might survive whatever was coming. Ms. Harper, Claire began, after reviewing the documents Emily had faxed over the night before. I want to start by telling you what I see in these charges. You're listed as a person of interest, not as a primary defendant. That suggests the prosecution believes you have information they want, not that they're convinced of your guilt. Emily felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. So I'm not actually under criminal investigation. You're what we call a potential cooperating witness, Claire explained. The prosecution wants to determine what you knew about Marcus's activities and when you knew it. If they're satisfied that you were genuinely unaware of his crimes, they'll likely offer you immunity in exchange for testimony against him. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What does that mean in practical terms? What kind of cooperation are they expecting? They'll want Emily to testify about her knowledge of Marcus's business activities, their joint finances, and any suspicious behavior she might have observed. Claire replied. They're also requesting access to joint bank accounts, tax returns, and personal correspondence. Emily felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly made her dizzy. So this nightmare could actually have a positive resolution? If you cooperate fully and your testimony is helpful in convicting Marcus, yes, Claire said carefully. But Emily, I need you to understand that testifying against your husband will be emotionally difficult. The defense will try to paint you as either complicit or willfully ignorant. 3 days later, Emily sat in the FBI conference room, facing Special Agent Patricia Morrison across a polished table. The agent was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every expression, every hesitation. Ms. Harper, Agent Morrison began, we appreciate your willingness to cooperate with our investigation. I want you to understand that anything you tell us today must be completely truthful. Any deception or omission could result in criminal charges against you. Emily felt her mouth go dry, but Daniel's steady presence beside her, Claire had agreed to let him attend as emotional support, gave her the courage to meet Agent Morrison's gaze directly. I understand, Emily said. I want to help you get justice for Marcus's victims. I want to tell you everything I know. For the next 4 hours, Emily answered questions with painstaking honesty, describing her marriage to a man who had systematically excluded her from all financial decisions while creating an elaborate fiction about their family's wealth and security. With each answer, the picture became clearer. Emily had been living in a carefully constructed bubble, shielded from the reality of how their lifestyle was being funded. Based on your responses today and the evidence we've reviewed, Agent Morrison said as the interview concluded, I'm confident that you were not aware of your husband's criminal activities. The Bureau is prepared to offer you immunity from prosecution in exchange for your testimony against Marcus. Emily felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me." But Agent Morrison wasn't finished. "There's one more thing we need to discuss. Your husband wasn't working alone. We've identified his primary partner in these crimes, and it's someone whose connection to this case may come as a shock." Emily felt a familiar dread building in her stomach. "Who?" Agent Morrison consulted her file one more time before delivering the revelation that would change everything. Victoria Grant, Daniel's ex-wife. The conference room fell silent as Emily processed this information. She turned to look at Daniel, seeing her own shock reflected in his face. "Victoria was involved in Marcus's financial crimes?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. "More than involved," Agent Morrison replied grimly. "Based on recovered communications, Victoria appears to have been the mastermind behind the entire operation. She used her inside knowledge of your company, Mr. Grant, to identify targets for investment fraud, then worked with Marcus to create fake financial products that they sold to wealthy clients." Emily felt sick as the implications became clear. So while Marcus was cheating on me with Victoria, Victoria was cheating on Daniel with Marcus? "It appears their relationship began approximately 3 years ago," Morrison confirmed. "The timing suggests that Victoria's affair with Marcus predated her abandonment of Sophie and her divorce from Daniel." Emily stared at the documents spread across the table, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. "So our entire marriages were just elaborate cons. We were marks in their long-term fraud?" "In essence, yes," Agent Morrison said gently. "These two individuals are sophisticated criminals who spent years perfecting their deception. Your social connections in Bellevue's legal community gave Marcus access to potential victims. Your company's technology and reputation, Mr. Grant, gave their schemes credibility." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. "They used our marriages as cover for their crimes?" "I'm afraid so," Morrison replied. "And there's one more thing you need to know. Victoria Grant is currently a fugitive. She disappeared 4 days ago, apparently warned by someone that we were closing in on the operation. Her apartment has been cleared out, her bank accounts emptied, and we have evidence suggesting she's fled the country." Emily felt Daniel tense beside her, and she instinctively reached for his hand. The gesture was automatic, born from shared shock and mutual support, but the warmth of his fingers intertwining with hers felt like an anchor in the storm of revelations. "Missing how?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Like, permanently gone missing? We believe she and Marcus had been planning their escape for months," Agent Morrison continued. "We've found evidence of offshore accounts, false documentation, and travel arrangements that suggest they intended to disappear together once they'd stolen enough money to fund a comfortable exile." Emily stared at the FBI agent, trying to process what she was hearing. "Marcus was planning to leave Lily and me behind? Permanently?" "Based on the communications we've recovered, yes. There are also discussions about custody strategies designed to make you appear unstable or unfit, presumably to gain leverage in their escape plans." Emily felt rage building in her chest, hotter and more fierce than anything she'd experienced during the divorce proceedings. "They were going to take our children's mothers away and frame us as the unstable ones?" Emily asked, her voice barely controlled. "It appears that was part of their plan," Morrison said carefully. "However, Ms. Harper, I want you to understand that none of these schemes will succeed now. Marcus Morrison is in federal custody and will likely face 20 to 30 years in prison. Any custody threats from a convicted felon carry no legal weight whatsoever." As they left the FBI offices 2 hours later, Emily felt emotionally drained but also strangely liberated. The weight of potential criminal charges had been lifted, replaced by the clearer picture of her role as a victim rather than a perpetrator. But the revelation about Marcus and Victoria's partnership had opened new wounds, the knowledge that her entire marriage had been not just a lie, but a calculated fraud. "Coffee," Daniel suggested as they stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building, both of them blinking in the afternoon sunlight like people emerging from a long darkness. "I think we could both use something normal right now," Emily agreed. They found a small cafe a few blocks away, tucked into a corner booth where they could process everything they'd learned. "I keep thinking about Sophie," Emily said as she wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "How do you explain to a 9-year-old that her mother wasn't just absent, but was actually a criminal who used her father's love to commit fraud?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring into his own cup. "The same way you explain to a 6-year-old that her father wasn't just unfaithful, but was stealing money to fund his secret life, I suppose. Very carefully, with lots of help from therapists." "Do you think they'll catch Victoria?" Emily asked. "Eventually, probably," Daniel replied. "The FBI seems confident, and she's not exactly experienced at being a fugitive. But Emily, even if they never find her, it doesn't matter. She's already lost everything that mattered, her daughter, her freedom, her future. She chose money over love, and that's a choice she'll have to live with forever." Emily studied Daniel's face, seeing not bitterness, but a kind of sad resignation. "You're not angry?" "I'm furious," Daniel admitted. "But not at Victoria anymore. I'm angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, for putting Sophie through the trauma of abandonment when the signs were probably there all along." Emily felt a flash of recognition. "You're doing what I've been doing, blaming yourself for not being psychic enough to detect sophisticated manipulation." "Maybe," Daniel said with a rueful smile. "But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things." Emily reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, mimicking the gesture of support he'd offered her in the FBI office. "Then let me tell you what you told me. You are not responsible for Victoria's choices. You are not responsible for her lies, her theft, or her abandonment of Sophie. You trusted your wife. That doesn't make you complicit in her crimes. It makes you human." Daniel looked at their joined hands, then up at Emily's face, seeing determination and compassion in her expression. "How did we get so lucky?" he asked quietly. "To find each other in the middle of all this chaos?" Emily felt her breath catch at the question. "I don't know if it's luck," she said carefully. "Maybe it's just that people who've been broken in similar ways recognize each other. Maybe we needed someone who would understand without explanation." "Is that what this is?" Daniel asked, his thumb tracing gently over her knuckles. "Understanding?" Emily considered the question seriously. Over the past weeks, what had started as neighborly courtesy had evolved into something deeper. Shared meals while the girls played, long conversations about rebuilding after betrayal, the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need to perform strength for each other. "I think," Emily said slowly, "it's the beginning of understanding. And maybe that's enough for now." Daniel's smile was soft but certain. More than enough. The media attention began 3 days later, when Marcus's arrest made the front page of the Seattle Times. "Prominent attorney charged in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme," the headline read, accompanied by photos of both Marcus and Victoria. Emily's phone started ringing at 6 a.m., reporters wanting comments, former friends suddenly curious about details they'd never cared about before. Daniel proved invaluable during the media circus that followed. He helped Emily craft a brief statement expressing her cooperation with federal investigators and her commitment to helping Marcus's victims find justice. More importantly, he provided a buffer between Emily and the more aggressive journalists, his CEO experience with hostile media proving surprisingly useful. "How do you stay so calm?" Emily asked after a particularly intrusive reporter had tried to corner her in the school parking lot. Practice? Daniel said dryly. 3 years ago, when Victoria left, the business press had a field day speculating about the impact on Grant Technologies. I learned that the best response to unwanted attention is boring consistency. Give them nothing interesting, and they'll move on to more exciting stories. The strategy worked. Within 2 weeks, the initial media frenzy had died down to occasional follow-up articles, but the attention had an unexpected side effect. It forced Emily and Daniel to publicly acknowledge their growing relationship. When a photo of them leaving the federal courthouse together appeared in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, they realized their careful privacy was no longer sustainable. "I'm sorry," Daniel said as they looked at the newspaper photo together. "I know you weren't ready for public scrutiny of our relationship." Emily studied the image, herself and Daniel walking side by side, his hand protectively on her back, both of them looking serious but united. "Actually," she said slowly, "I'm not sorry. We look like a team, like people who support each other through difficult times. I'm proud to be associated with you, even in a scandal rag." Daniel felt something shift in his chest at her words. "Are you saying you're ready to stop hiding what's happening between us?" Emily met his eyes directly, seeing hope and vulnerability in his expression. "I'm saying I'm ready to stop being afraid of what's happening between us. I'm saying that what we have is worth protecting, even if it means dealing with nosy reporters and curious neighbors." The conversation that followed was the one they'd been building toward for weeks. Honest, careful, full of the kind of emotional intimacy that had been missing from both their previous marriages. They talked about their fears, their hopes, their concerns about blending families and building trust after betrayal. "I love you," Daniel said as the conversation wound down, the words emerging with quiet certainty. "I know it's soon, and I know it's complicated, but I love your strength, your grace, your ability to find hope in the middle of devastation. I love watching you rebuild your life with such intention and care." Emily felt her breath catch at his declaration, seeing absolute sincerity in his expression. "I love you too," she whispered back. "I love your patience, your kindness, the way you've helped me remember that not all men use love as a weapon. I love watching you with Sophie, seeing how you've rebuilt yourself into exactly the father she needs." As Daniel kissed her for the first time, really kissed her, with all the tenderness and promise that had been building between them for months, Emily realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the worst circumstances. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted before you can recognize what you actually need. 6 months later, Emily stood on the witness stand in federal court, telling the truth about her marriage to Marcus Morrison with a clear voice and steady hands. The courtroom was packed with victims of Marcus and Victoria's schemes, people who had lost their life savings to the elaborate fraud. But Emily felt strong enough to face them, strong enough to help deliver the justice they deserved. Daniel sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, his presence both reassuring and empowering. Beside him sat Sophie and Lily, who had insisted on coming to help Mommy Emily be brave. The sight of her chosen family, for that's what they'd become, gave Emily the courage to withstand the defense attorney's attempts to paint her as either complicit or willfully ignorant. "Ms. Harper," the prosecutor said during direct examination, "can you tell the court about the financial documents your husband provided for your review during your marriage?" Emily looked directly at the jury as she answered. "My husband created an entirely false financial reality for me to live in. He showed me fabricated bank statements, fake investment reports, even altered tax documents. I trusted him completely, which he used to ensure I never saw any evidence of his criminal activities." The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Marcus was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Victoria remained a fugitive, though the FBI had tracked her to several countries and remained confident they would eventually apprehend her. After the sentencing, Emily walked out of the courthouse into the Seattle sunshine, where Daniel and both girls were waiting for her. "It's over," she said simply, and felt the weight of 3 years of legal proceedings finally lift from her shoulders. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked, taking her hand as they walked toward their car. Emily looked at him, at the man who had seen her at her most broken and chosen to help her rebuild, who had weathered federal investigations and media attention and the complicated process of blending 2 wounded families into something beautiful. "Now we live," Emily said simply. "We stop surviving and start living." That evening, as they sat together on the deck of the house they'd bought in a quiet neighborhood where Sophie and Lily could ride bikes and climb trees, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She'd learned that trust wasn't about the absence of risk, but about finding someone worth the risk. She'd discovered that love after betrayal wasn't impossible, just more intentional, more precious for having been earned rather than simply given. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked softly, echoing a conversation they'd had many times as their relationship deepened and their families blended. Emily looked out at the Seattle skyline, thinking about the woman who had sat crying on a marble floor 3 years ago, broken and afraid, and convinced that trust was a luxury she could never afford again. "Not a single one," she said, and meant it completely. Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the words, "I don't know how to start over." And sometimes the answer is simply this: you start with the truth, even when it's ugly. You start with kindness, even when you're afraid. And you start with someone who's brave enough to start over with you, one careful step at a time. The rain had stopped falling, and for the first time in years, Emily Harper was exactly where she belonged.